Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with my colleagues Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Specialist, Brian Dougherty, the Northeast Iowa Ag Engineer, and Assistant Teaching Professor at ISU, Gail Carpenter, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us, Fred.
This week, we're discussing management and implementation of automatic calf feeders. While they have been around for many years, it seems new ideas in facility design, feeding, and management surface as more producers implement the technology. Brian, as we start today's conversation, what are some of the general barn design principles that, regardless of individual or group housing, producers should consider?
Yeah, that's a good question, Fred. So the first thing I would mention when you're looking at designing a calf barn facility is just make sure that you've got enough feed and water space for each animal. You know, this applies again to any type of facility you're looking at constructing. And then I'd really encourage people to try to provide natural ventilation for at least part of your ventilation system, and provide some exposure to natural light as well. Just makes for a better environment for those young calves. But if you need to, you also want to incorporate some mechanical ventilation into the barn, especially for minimum wintertime ventilation. The positive pressure tube systems work really well for that. So curtain barns are ideal, but provide some mechanical ventilation if it's needed as well. Then you want to try to design your barn so that you can maintain socially stable groups over time. If you're thinking about putting in an automatic calf feeder, you know, you're going to have different group pens more than likely. And so you want to try to have not too wide of an age range between those groups, and just think about how you're going to move those calves from group to group going through that facility. And then bedding management is another one I really encourage people to pay attention to, because, you know, providing a clean, dry space, a deep bedded space for those calves to lay can really help reduce some of your respiratory problems. It can be just as important as your ventilation system for helping to prevent pneumonia issues. As far as space, you probably want a minimum of 30 square feet per calf, and that's bedded space. That doesn't include alleys or any space that doesn't have bedding. And, you know, more than that would certainly be better. And if you can do an all-in, all-out design, you know, that's not going to work for every farm, because you may not have enough calves to justify that, but that can really help break up some of those disease cycles. And then the last thing I would say is I would just really encourage people to avoid using, you know, raised decks or slatted floors or those type of facilities where you don't have any bedding under those calves, because it's just really challenging to manage the ventilation and keep the temperature regulated in those facilities when you don't have any bedding. You know, that's a really fine balance there to get that to work and still have healthy calves.
Let's follow up on that, Brian. You mentioned a lot of different things. Give us your top two priorities that producers should review prior to making the switch to group housing.
Yeah, I would just say before you switch to group housing, you know, you just want to make sure that your management's already, you know, up to snuff, I'd say. So your failure of passive transfer, ideally you want that to be less than 5%, and also your mortality rate should be less than 5%. So those are the two main things that I would look at. You know, if you're considerably over that, you know, you might have some real challenges if you want to switch to a, you know, more of a group facility or calf barn type facility. So those are the two main indicators I'd look at. And then from there, you just want to think about, you know, how you're going to set that barn up. Still going to need some individual pens for the first anywhere up to 2 weeks, depending on how you're going to use that facility. So you want to plan that transition strategy, and also plan your weaning strategy. You know, how long are you going to take to wean those calves off? One thing you can do here, if you're not sure if you're ready for group housing, you know, and large group pens, is think about maybe just doing paired housing or triplet housing. If you've got calf huts or individual pens, maybe pull some dividers, or just use your paneling to combine a couple of calf huts together. Give that a try before you make the jump to full, large group sizes if you're not sure if you're ready for that yet.
You mentioned some facilities design management options, and sometimes when I'm visiting with producers or I'm out on farm talking about their calf program, they might have a retrofit facility, and you mentioned the square footage, like 30 square feet per calf. Do you find, like, if you're dealing with a retrofit and maybe a lower ceiling, should they be giving more space to those calves? And then my second question is on the curtains. At what temperature should we be considering to lower those curtains for the year?
Sure. So as far as providing more space, with the lower ceilings, the main issue there is sort of how much volume you have per calf. So when we're designing ventilation, that's one of the numbers that we'd look at. So the main thing is just making sure you have enough air changes per hour, especially if we're talking about wintertime ventilation. I do see a lot of facilities that are older, low ceilings. They tend to be flat. Maybe they're in the basement of a barn. And that's where those positive pressure tube systems can really help out. So you don't necessarily need more bedding space per calf with that lower ceiling. The main thing there is just make sure that bedding is nice and dry and they're deep bedded, and make sure you've got enough air movement through that facility, on either an air changes per hour basis or a per calf basis. If you've got a curtain sided facility, you had a question about when to raise and lower those curtains. So, generally I'd say in the wintertime, somewhere in that, 45-degree range, you want to start thinking about dropping those curtains. And by the time it's 70 degrees, at least during the daytime, for example, you should be able to open those curtains entirely. Kind of depends on how much you want to play with those curtains, on a day-to-day basis, if you want to open them during the day and close them at night, or if you just want to kind of set them and leave them. If you've got an automatic curtain system with thermostat control, that's great, but a lot of people don't have those. So it's probably going to be more of a gradual process. Just start cracking those curtains open as it's getting well up above freezing. And then by the time it's in the mid 70s, your curtain should be wide open.
Gail, Brian brought up some good points on facility design and things to consider before moving to group housing. Tell us about the nutrition side of the management. What are some basic management practices that we should always consider in any feeding program?
Yeah, so when we're feeding pre-weaned calves, our goal is going to be to double that birth weight between birth and weaning. So we want those calves to be doubling in size by the time we're transitioning them out completely from being milk fed. The first step that really want to emphasize is incredibly important is getting them really good quality colostrum. That colostrum needs to be good quality, needs to be in high enough quantity, and needs to get to those calves quickly. So that can't be, the importance of a good colostrum management program really can't be understated. And then kind of going along with some of the things that Brian said, talking about the calves' environment, we really want those calves to be putting whatever they take in energy from their milk or milk replacer needs to be going towards growth, needs to be going towards that goal of doubling their birth weight, not fighting off infection, not dealing with heat stress or cold stress. And that's going to tie in with some of the stuff that Jen talked about too, with cleanliness too, and making sure that those calves are in a really hygienic environment as well. So we need to make sure to really maximize that feeding program that calves can devote that energy towards growth and not towards dealing with stressors in their environment. Really, any calf program, we should be promoting solid feed intake as well. So getting those calves starting to consume the starter and really getting some of that rumen development starting as early as possible, making sure that we have solid feed available to the calves and that it's not getting wet or moldy, that's good fresh feed that's palatable to the calves. And we want to make sure that they have access to clean water as well. So we think of calves as drinking a lot of milk. That doesn't mean that they don't need water intake. And just like any other animal on the farm, that water needs to be clean and needs to be accessible. So one of the benefits of automatic feeders, calves are really capable of drinking a lot of milk, a lot more milk than we've maybe given them traditionally. And one of the benefits of putting them on an automatic feeding system is that we can really take advantage of some of that calf's biology there as well. It is possible to increase milk feeding levels in individual hutches or calf barns when you're feeding calves individually. But those automatic feeding systems really make that a piece of cake for managers feeding calves.
And in making that transition to group housing, what are some of the feeding considerations producers should be aware of that they wouldn't necessarily do in individual fed calves?
Well, of course, when we're talking about group housing, we're talking about some of those facilities and environment and management things that Brian talked about. And that's going to be a drain on the calves' energy if we're not doing that right. So that is one thing. But there's also going to be a learning curves for calves at the beginning, right? So they're going to be coming in and not sure of their feed is coming from, where their milk is coming from. So they're going to have to learn the system when they move into an automatic feeding system. One of the nice things about having calves that are group houses, they can kind of learn from each other. That's a benefit there. They can learn socially. The other nice thing about an automatic feeding system is that it will kind of flag calves and tell you as a manager, you have calves that are struggling, you're not really learning, they're missing meals or they're not eating enough. And so you can kind of pay some of that individual attention to those calves as they're kind of learning the system. And then one of the other benefits on the other end of that weaning process, or that pre-weaning process, is that as you wean calves off milk or milk replacer, you can do a nice gradual smooth step down with those automatic feeders. And those are easily programmable into whatever robotic system you're using. Instead of going, if you're in an individual housing, you might have to go from 3 meals to 2 meals to 1 meal and have more of a literal step in your step down process. Those automatic feeders will make it more of a gradual decline, so the calf doesn't really notice that she's drinking less milk and eating more starter.
Let's follow up on the weaning side of the auto feeders. Should we be weaning on body weight, age, or starter intake?
So starter intake is kind of a gold standard, but it's not necessarily achievable on a lot of farms, especially if you're group housing. You don't have that individual starter intake most of the time. So in theory, in a perfect world, we would know every calf's starter intake, and we'd be able to say this calf is now eating enough starter, we can completely remove milk. That's not feasible in the facilities with the technology that we have right now. So age is a really great, easy starting point, or days from being moved into group housing. Those are really great starting points. And of course, you can always program for individual calves. If you have a calf who's maybe not being as successful and needs to stay on for a little bit longer, that can be done individually.
Jen, there are a lot of moving parts when we consider using automatic calf feeding systems, and cleanliness can be a major factor in calf health. How can producers evaluate hygiene in their feeding equipment?
Sure, Fred, that's a good question. I think that's been kind of a hot topic here in the last couple of years as we take a look at, we're doing a good job feeding and colostrum management and our housing systems. And now we're really trying to evaluate, making sure that we're providing a clean feeding space for those calves. So first off, I like to think about, just like your kitchen at your home or your favorite restaurant, you want to make sure that's a place where it's a dedicated space for all of your feeding equipment, your ingredients, a place to store that milk or milk replacer. It doesn't have to be something new or fancy, but just a dedicated space where that's where I'm going to house all my detergents and sanitizers, and make sure that that's a good place for hot and cold water to be able to sanitize equipment. And with automatic calf feeders, obviously that comes with a lot of working parts, a lot more hoses and things that milk has to travel through. So that provides or opens up an opportunity for bacteria, biofilm buildup, those sorts of things. And so we've kind of adapted from the food industry some evaluation tools, hygiene monitoring tools. And one that we use is the ATP meter or luminometer. That is something that maybe your industry providers, veterinarians would have. It's a little bit more expensive to have, but if you're going to do a hygiene audit, they would come out and swab different areas of the facility, hoses, nipples, buckets, those types of things, to get an idea of, are your cleaning practices high quality, or do we need to go back and revisit? The luminometer is one way. It measures the light or the intensity of the light. So the more bacteria that are present on a surface, the more that it's going to express a relative light unit number. So the higher that number, the more bacteria that you have present. So it doesn't necessarily give you what type of bacteria, but it just tells you, yes, there's bacteria present, and we need to evaluate that. So if you're using a luminometer, acceptable would be anything less than 100 relative light units. So and working with farms or classes that I've done with ISU, we have students that go out and they'll go out and swab different areas of the barn, and we come back and see what we get, and then talk about why is that. Maybe we're collecting milk from a bucket and then we're transferring it to
hose, and then it has to go into the feeder. So what are those collection points, and how are we cleaning each of those collection points? So that's one way. So the other option that I find more common is these protein swabs. And these are more of a quick test that producers can use. And it's essentially the same concept of swabbing different areas to evaluate the equipment, but instead of giving you a number like the relative light units, it will actually give you a color coding based on the chemical reaction between what you swabbed and what it reads with that chemical reaction. So I find that more common on farms. It's a little bit cheaper and practical to, maybe monthly do a farm audit where you're going and swabbing a few areas of the barn and getting that color reading. That gives you a quick evaluation of what's going on. We all get busy with different things. Maybe it's fieldwork time, or we have new employees on the farm. Those are times that we might see an increase in, cleanliness, quality control issues, because we're busy doing other things. And so this kind of goes back and let's review, let's retrain, and make sure that we're back on target.
What would be your cleaning checklist for an automatic calf feeder?
Well, for automatic calf feeders, there's, again, a lot of working parts here, but number one is making sure that it's calibrated. Gail talked about can provide higher volumes of milk replacer in these systems, but we also have to make sure that it's calibrated correctly, because if the accuracy of the powder and the water are off, we could potentially increase or decrease the amount of solids that are actually being fed to the calf. So that can ultimately affect how that calf is growing. So we want to make sure that we're checking that powder outlet on the hopper where we're actually dumping that milk powder into, because if it gets any moisture, we could get some caking around that. And that would really restrict the flow of powder coming out and ultimately affect, again, the solids that calf is receiving. Using proper detergents for, external and internal cleaning of the system, regularly checking and replacing those hoses and nipples, checking for cracks on anything that's rubber. Those are all places that can allow for bacteria to build up. So, monitoring that cleaning cycle. I know it's automatic, but still making sure that it's running properly. And then just manually cleaning too, right? So just like anything, if it looks dirty, it probably is dirty. So we need to just make sure that we're still manually cleaning things that need to be cleaned. And then if you're running into any problems, your equipment dealers are going to be that person that you really need to visit with as far as getting some help and getting maybe new equipment installed or reevaluated for calibration.
I get a lot of questions on when should I be offering water to calves? How does water intake and quality affect growth?
Yeah, Fred, I get that question a lot too. Should I offer it right away? Should I wait 2-3 weeks? And I think the last NOM study actually showed an average time that producers are offering water is close to 14 days, which is really going to delay their ability to intake calf starter. If they start to intake that calf starter at an earlier age, that's really going to drive that rumen development. And water is a big driving force of rumen development. So I would say as soon as you can get those calves in an individual pen, within a couple of days, start offering them water. And then once you transition to the automatic calf feeder, most systems have a watering system within that pen that's automatic. So they're going to probably follow those older calves and pick up on that a little bit sooner, but also making sure that the water that's in that automatic calf feeder or automatic feeding station is clean, because it takes a lot of water for that calf to properly digest everything. If they're getting a lot more milk, a lot more starter, it's going to take more water. So just making sure that we're cleaning that feeder, cleaning that water, or wherever they're getting access to water is important. We can check the water quality at least annually, particularly if we don't feel like our calves are performing like they should. That might be something that you want to check in case there's elevated levels of bacteria like E. coli or coliform counts, because that's really going to affect the calf's immune system. If they're fighting off bacteria from the water that they're intaking, they can't fight off other things that are going on. So if the levels are high, that's a good time to visit with either your veterinarian or somebody that can help you install maybe a water treatment system.
As we wrap up today's discussion, you all have been on many farms with automatic calf feeders. If I was someone making the decision to go that route, what are a couple of key points you'd want me to know before buying an automatic calf feeding system?
Again, going back to kind of what I mentioned earlier, the key points to keep in mind before you buy an automatic calf feeder is just making sure that you already have good failure of passive transfer of immunity, less than 5%, and mortality less than 5%. So you want your current management to be a good place before you make the move to an automatic calf feeder. That can just really help prevent a lot of issues in the longer run going with group pens. And then again, with the group pens themselves, again, just make sure you've got a nice deep bedded, clean, dry place for those calves to live. That can really help prevent a lot of issues.
Well, I know this has been said before by others, and so I don't think this is particularly earth-shattering. And it's the same thing we say when cows move on to robotic milking systems, but can save you labor costs, but there's still labor involved, and it's a different type of labor. It's a management labor, and not so much, somebody actually feeding the calves, but you still have to actually actively manage the automatic feeding systems, and that kind of ties in with what Brian was saying there as well. You need to make sure as a facility you're already doing an excellent job calf rearing before you transition on to using an automatic feeding system.
Yeah, I would echo the thoughts that Brian and Gail mentioned, as well as, we've done some producer surveys looking at their management systems with automatic feeders and getting their thoughts on their challenges and things that they like about the feeders. But, the challenges that they talk about a lot is just making sure that the machine is well maintained and that we're looking at cleanliness, because those are some things that might fall between the cracks. And when we're dealing with a lot of calves in a group setting, we really got to pay attention to detail. So I would just say paying attention to those little things can really add up to a successful calf program.
I do want to remind everyone that these three folks were part of the webinar on managing automatic calf feeders, and it will be posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this recorded podcast for those wanting further view and get more information. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks,
Thanks
everybody.
for having us.
I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us today and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.